I lived in an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the best neighborhood, but it was cheap, and I didn't mind the creaky floors or drafty windows. Most nights were quiet, with the occasional car passing by or the distant sounds of city life. One particular night, though, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a soft tapping sound. It was faint at first, almost like the wind brushing against the glass. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was too rhythmic to be the wind. My window was locked, but the sound seemed like it was coming from the outside. I brushed it off, assuming it was just my imagination, and rolled over to go back to sleep. The tapping continued, more insistent this time. Eventually, I got out of bed and cautiously pulled back the curtains. What I saw next made my heart drop. Just inches from the glass, there was a face, a pale, expressionless face, with wide eyes staring directly at me. The figure didn't move or blink. It just smiled, an eerie, toothy grin that sent a wave of cold terror down my spine. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. By the time I looked back, the face was gone. I called the police, but they didn't find anyone outside. I couldn't explain how someone had reached my second-story window without a ladder or any nearby trees. For weeks after, I kept the curtains closed at night, but every so often, I'd hear that same faint tapping, and I'd wonder if the smiling face would return. Growing up, I always hated our basement. It was damp, cold, and smelled like mildew. The worst part was that my room was directly above it, and at night, I would hear all sorts of strange sounds, creaking pipes, shifting boxes, and what I assumed was the house settling. But as I got older, the noises became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't just random bumps and thuds, sometimes it sounded like whispers. I could never make out the words, but I swore I heard voices. One night, I was home alone, and the voices were louder than usual. My curiosity got the best of me, so I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check it out. As I descended the basement stairs, the air got colder, and the whispering seemed to stop. Everything was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked behind the furnace, under the stairs, and in every corner. Nothing. Just as I was about to go back upstairs, I noticed the door to the crawl space was slightly ajar. That door had always been shut, locked even, but now it was wide open. My heart raced as I slowly approached. Shining my flashlight inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a pile of dirty blankets, empty food wrappers, and a flashlight. Someone had been living in our crawl space. I bolted upstairs and called the police. They came, searched the area, but whoever had been there was long gone. They told us the person could have been staying there for months. I never went back down to the basement again, and we moved out not long after. It was late after a night out with friends, and I was tired and ready to go home. I ordered an Uber, and within a few minutes, a car pulled up. I didn't think twice about getting in. The driver didn't say much, which I thought was normal for some late-night rides. I gave him my address, and we started driving through the dimly lit streets. A few minutes into the ride, I received a notification from the Uber app, "Your driver is arriving now." I stared at the message in confusion. I was already in the car. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The driver's face didn't match the profile picture on the app. I asked him, "Are you my Uber driver?" He didn't answer. Instead, he kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I started to panic. I tried asking again, but this time with more urgency. "Sir, can you pull over? I think I got in the wrong car." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror but said nothing. At that moment, I knew something was wrong. I frantically grabbed the door handle, realizing I hadn't locked it when I got in. Without thinking, I opened the door and jumped out as the car slowed down at a red light. I hit the ground hard, scraped my knees, but I didn't care. I got up and ran as fast as I could to a nearby gas station. I reported the incident to the police and the Uber company, but they never found the car or the man. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't jumped out. Working the late shift at a 24-hour diner wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The diner was usually quiet around 2 a.m., with the occasional trucker or group of college kids stopping by. But there was one regular who gave me the creeps. He'd come in every night at the same time, always sit in the corner booth, and never order anything. He'd just sit there, staring straight ahead, occasionally glancing at me. At first, I thought he might be homeless or just lonely, but after a few weeks, his behavior started to make me uncomfortable. He never spoke to me or anyone else, and he always left without a word. One night, while I was in the back washing dishes, I heard the front door chime. I figured it was him leaving early, but when I came out to the front, I saw something that made my skin crawl. On the table where he usually sat, there was a folded piece of paper. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "I've been watching you for a long time." My heart dropped. I scanned the diner, but there was no sign of him. I ran to the door and locked it, not sure what to do next. The police were called, but they couldn't track him down. I quit the job the next morning and never went back. I lived in a quiet apartment building where no one really bothered each other. My neighbor across the hall was a strange guy, always kept to himself, never spoke, and rarely left his apartment. I'd occasionally hear muffled sounds through the walls, but it was never loud enough to disturb me. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something unusual coming from his apartment. It sounded like someone was crying, but it was faint, almost like it was being stifled. I paused, listening closely, and then heard what sounded like a low, desperate voice. It wasn't crying anymore, it was pleading. I debated whether to knock on his door, but something about it felt off. I convinced myself it was none of my business and went to bed, but the sounds continued throughout the night, keeping me awake. The next morning, the apartment was silent. Later that day, I noticed the door to his apartment was slightly ajar. It was strange because it was always closed. I hesitated before gently pushing it open and stepping inside. The place smelled terrible, like rotting food, and the air was thick and stale. As I ventured further in, I saw something that made my stomach churn. My neighbor was sitting in his chair, completely still, his eyes wide open. But he wasn't breathing. His skin was pale and bloated, and it didn't take long to realize he had been dead for some time, days, maybe even a week. Whatever I heard that night, it wasn't him. I love hiking and often go alone on trails near my house. There's a particular path I like that winds through a dense forest, offering peace and quiet away from the city. One day, I decided to go for an evening hike. The sun was setting, but I figured I had enough daylight left to make it back before dark. About halfway through the trail, I got the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the eerie atmosphere of the forest, but then I heard footsteps behind me. They were soft, but they matched my pace. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I quickened my pace, they did too. I glanced over my shoulder but saw no one. My heart started racing as the realization hit me, I wasn't alone. I started walking faster, but the footsteps continued to follow. I debated running, but I didn't want to make it obvious that I was scared. I kept walking, my eyes darting around, trying to catch a glimpse of who or what was following me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker, and the footsteps grew closer. I finally broke into a run, sprinting down the trail, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where my car was the only one left. I jumped in and locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trail behind me, but I didn't see anyone. I never went hiking alone again. My friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for the weekend. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway, but things quickly took a strange turn. On the second night, we were all hanging out in the living room when we heard a knock at the door. It was late, and we weren't expecting anyone, so we hesitated. One of my friends peeked through the window, but there was no one there. We brushed it off as a prank or maybe just our imagination, but then it happened again, this time louder. We opened the door, but again, no one was there. The strange part was, there were no footprints in the snow outside. Over the next few hours, the knocking continued, always when we weren't near the door. It was starting to freak us out. We checked the security camera the next morning, hoping it would explain what was happening. What we saw chilled us to the bone. The footage showed a man in dark clothes walking up to the door, knocking, and then quickly retreating into the woods. He did this several times throughout the night, always hiding just out of sight. We packed up and left the cabin early, not wanting to stick around to find out who he was or what he wanted. I was walking home from school one afternoon when I noticed a black van parked a few houses down from mine. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked past, the engine started and the van began creeping slowly behind me. I picked up my pace, trying to act like I hadn't noticed, but the van kept following, staying just far enough behind that it wasn't obvious. I turned the corner, hoping it would drive off, but it followed me again. My heart raced as I considered my options. There weren't many people around, and my house was still a few blocks away. I decided to make a run for it, sprinting down the street. The van sped up, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to pull up beside me. I reached my house and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I peeked through the curtains and saw the van parked across the street, the driver just sitting there, watching. After what felt like hours, the van finally drove off. For weeks after, I kept seeing that same van around town. It never followed me again, but it was always lurking, just out of sight. It was a Friday night, and I was home alone, relaxing after a long week. Around 11 p.m., my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be a friend. There was a brief silence, followed by heavy breathing on the other end. I hung up, figuring it was a prank call. A few minutes later, the phone rang again, another blocked number. This time, a low, raspy voice said my name. I froze. "Who is this?" I asked, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard more heavy breathing, followed by a soft chuckle. I hung up again, now feeling uneasy. The calls kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. I tried blocking the numbers, but they always seemed to find a way through. The final voicemail I received was the worst. The voice, calm and slow, said, "I'm closer than you think." I called the police, but they couldn't trace the calls. To this day, I don't know who it was or how they knew my name, but I haven't felt safe in my own home since. I was on a road trip, driving through the night, when exhaustion hit me hard. I decided to pull over at a small, run-down motel I'd spotted on the side of the highway. The place looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades, but I was too tired to care. The man at the front desk gave me an odd look when I asked for a room, but he handed me a key without a word. I made my way to my room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It was as dingy as I expected, old carpet, faded wallpaper, and a flickering light. But there was something else. The room felt off. The air was heavy, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I brushed it off as fatigue and collapsed onto the bed. I had just closed my eyes when I heard a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the closet. I stared at the door, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. I jumped up, ready to run, but the room was empty, no one was there. I rushed out of the room and back to the front desk, demanding to know what was going on. The man looked at me with pity in his eyes and said, "You're not the first one to hear that." I didn't stay to find out what he meant. I grabbed my things, got in my car, and drove straight through the night. It was a late night, and I was walking home from work through the empty streets. It wasn't unusual to see a few people milling about at that hour, but tonight the streets were eerily deserted. As I rounded the corner to my apartment building, I noticed a man standing on the opposite sidewalk. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and had his back turned to me. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I passed by, I heard him whisper something. The words were soft, barely audible, but they sent a chill down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder, and to my horror, the man had turned around and was staring at me. His lips were moving, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling, but the whispering grew louder. It followed me, even as I turned the corner and entered my apartment building. By the time I reached my door, the whispering was deafening, like it was right in my ear. I slammed the door shut, but I could still hear him. I never saw the whispering man again, but every so often, I hear those soft, unintelligible whispers late at night. It was around midnight when I decided to take a shower before bed. I've always had a strange fear of mirrors, especially in the dark, but I kept the bathroom light on as I got ready. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash over me, when I felt a strange sensation, a sudden chill, like someone had opened a window. I wiped the steam off the glass shower door and looked at the mirror across the bathroom. For a split second, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the reflection, behind me, there was a face, pale, with dark, hollow eyes. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Shaken, I quickly finished my shower and left the bathroom. I didn't sleep well that night, and for days afterward, I avoided looking at the mirror too long. But every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, like someone's watching me through the glass. My grandmother passed away and left me her house, a small, cozy place in the countryside. While cleaning out her attic, I came across an old doll. It was porcelain, with a cracked face and faded clothes. My grandmother had always been fond of antiques, so I assumed it was just another one of her collectibles. I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, thinking nothing of it. But over the next few days, strange things began happening. I'd come home to find the doll in different positions, its head turned, or its hands moved. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then one night, I heard soft footsteps coming from the living room. I got up to check, and when I turned on the light, the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on the floor, facing the doorway, its cracked face smiling up at me. I threw the doll out the next morning, but I still hear those faint footsteps sometimes. When I was a kid, I lived in a house that had a huge tree just outside my bedroom window. At night, the branches would scrape against the glass, and I'd often get scared, thinking it was someone trying to get in. My parents always reassured me it was just the wind. One night, however, I woke up to a loud thud at the window. I turned over in bed and saw a shadowy figure standing just outside, staring in. I froze, unable to move, as the figure tapped on the glass with long, bony fingers. It didn't look like a person, it was too tall, too thin. I screamed, and my parents rushed in. By the time they turned on the light, the figure was gone. They said it was probably a bad dream, but I knew what I saw. I never slept with my window open again. I work as a security guard at an office building downtown. The job is usually quiet, especially at night, when the building is empty. One night, I was doing my rounds, checking the security cameras, when I saw something strange. On one of the floors, a light flickered on in an office that should have been locked. I went to investigate, thinking someone might have stayed late. When I got to the office, the door was ajar, and the light was still flickering. I stepped inside, but no one was there. The air was cold, and there was a strange smell, like something rotten. As I turned to leave, I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I looked back at the security monitor and froze. On the screen, standing in the middle of the room where I had just been, was a shadowy figure, staring directly at the camera. I rushed back to the office, but the room was empty again. I quit the job soon after that. It was a typical Saturday night, and I was hanging out with some friends at a local bar. After a few drinks, I decided to call it a night and head home. As I was walking out, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend, asking if I wanted to grab a late-night snack before heading home. I turned around and saw him standing by the bar, so I texted back, "Sure, let's go." As I approached him, I noticed something was off. He looked like my friend, but his face was slightly different, like a distorted version of him. I stopped in my tracks, confused, and at that moment, I got another text. It was from my real friend, asking where I was. When I looked back at the figure, it was gone. I ran out of the bar and never looked back. My friends and I rented an old farmhouse for the weekend, hoping to get away from the city. The place was beautiful during the day, but at night, it had an entirely different vibe. The house was surrounded by dense woods, and there were no neighbors for miles. On the second night, we were sitting around the fire when we heard a noise coming from the woods, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling. We assumed it was an animal, but the noises grew louder, closer. We all stopped talking and listened. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking around just beyond the tree line. One of my friends shined a flashlight into the woods, and for a brief moment, we saw something. It was tall, almost human-like, but its limbs were too long, its body too thin. It disappeared into the trees before we could get a better look. We didn't sleep much that night, and by morning, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up the car, I glanced back at the tree line and saw it again, watching us from the shadows. I started getting texts from an unknown number late at night. At first, they were just random messages, strings of numbers and letters that didn't make sense. I ignored them, assuming it was spam, but then the messages started getting more personal. They mentioned things about me that no one else should have known, my schedule, the places I went, even the clothes I was wearing that day. I tried blocking the number, but the texts kept coming from different numbers. One night, I got a message that made my blood run cold. I'm outside. I looked out the window, and there, standing across the street, was a figure in the shadows, staring directly at my apartment. I called the police, but they couldn't trace the number. The texts eventually stopped, but I still feel like I'm being watched. A few years ago, a group of us went camping deep in the woods. The first night was perfect, clear skies, a warm fire, and good company. But on the second night, one of our friends, Jake, went missing. We assumed he'd wandered off to use the bathroom, but when he didn't come back after an hour, we started to worry. We searched the woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Then, around midnight, we heard footsteps crunching in the leaves. We all turned toward the sound, expecting to see Jake, but instead, there was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It looked like him, but something was wrong, his posture was off, and his face was blank, emotionless. We called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. We packed up and left at dawn, but Jake was never found.